Greetings, friends. I hope you can all hear me. It is wonderful to be with you today. And John, thank you so much for the introduction. It's a joy to hear your voice. I'm deeply appreciative for the opportunity to share a little bit with you today, and I hope to be of some service in that. After I was asked to speak with you, in prayer, I heard a word, which was surrender. And in hearing that word, it occurred to me that I would begin today by sharing a story from my own life. And I'll preface that by saying we'll have a time where I share this story. I'm then going to share an abbreviated version of a presentation that I shared with FGC's executive committee about where we find ourselves as friends, the world in which we are operating our meetings and yearly meetings. We're also going to have some time for Q&A and a little bit of worship sharing as well. So with that, on July 4th, 1999, I was hiking atop a mesa at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico when I was overcome with heat stroke. I was 29 years old, and I was on a 2-week vacation from Dallas. After struggling to get from the mesa to the ranger station, I collapsed at the station. As I started drifting into shock, the ranger EMS on duty put an oxygen mask on me and reassured me, and I quote, "Today is not your day to die." I must admit, I did not find that reassuring, but I appreciated the enormous care. After a few minutes to get my body temperature stable and to hydrate, I scraped myself off the floor and walked out under my own power. My then partner, baffled by my behavior, loaded me in the car, and off we went. My belief, after fighting off numerous childhood illnesses, was that I decided when my body had a problem, and on that day, I decided I did not have a problem. I was in control, so I up and left. After 2 days in terrible shape and at the insistence of my then partner, I landed in an emergency room in Los Alamos. Once again, after talking with the doctor and running some tests, I stubbornly walked out of that ER, again under my own power, and went to go camp with my partner on the side of a mountain in Taos. When we arrived at the campsite, it was twilight. I saw the silhouette of someone sitting by a fire nearby. The person waved me towards them. For reasons I still cannot explain, I dropped the gear I was unloading from the car and walked silently over to them. My partner joined moments later. This person, whom I had never seen before in my life, shared that they were on a spiritual pilgrimage and talked about life and death for the next hour while we sat by that fire. I said very little. He ended by saying that he had a message for me. Control is not the way to God. In that moment, I felt the blood drain from my body. What he said was word for word what my best friend in Dallas had said to me in an intense conversation the week before I left for Chaco. My life was built on the idea of control and discipline. It's what had gotten me, as I'd mentioned, through a number of childhood illnesses. It's what had allowed me to achieve a number of things in my early 20s. And I had decided during that period of time that whatever amount of stress was necessary for me to achieve what I thought needed to be achieved, I could deal with. With that said, I had experienced a number of warning signs for much of the previous year that I was writing checks that my body and mind couldn't cash, and it all came to a head in Chaco. In the wilderness of New Mexico, I finally broke down, and with God's help, through the faithfulness of two messengers, I came to see clearly for the first time that the rock that I had built my world on, the idea of control, was actually an illusion. My health was shattered for the next year. I could barely work. I had crippling anxiety attacks that made my life very small. And my vision for what I thought I was going to be doing was just utterly obliterated. After a year of suffering out of sheer desperation, I finally surrendered to God. I stopped running. I stopped controlling. I acknowledged I did not have the answers to my life. And I imploded into God. After that, my health slowly started to return. And I also made the decision to move from Dallas to New Mexico and start over. God had shown me in dreams that I was to find a Quaker meeting and commit to friends, which I did. And I was very lucky to become a member of the Religious Society Friends through the Taos Worship Group in Santa Fe Monthly Meeting. For the next 4 years in Taos, with the help of Quakers, Buddhists, and others, I surrendered over and over and over again to God, painfully peeling back layer after layer of control until I learned how to listen to something that was not my own ego and was not based in fear. In the process, I learned to trust people. I learned through Quakers that you can trust spirit to see around the corners you cannot see around. I learned to trust process. I learned to trust community. And I learned to trust God. By my mid-30s, my life had become something I had never imagined. I was grateful to Spirit that I had been taken on that journey to a place that before Chaco, I did not know was possible. Years later, I realized that surrender is a way to empty ourselves so that we might be filled again. You may be thinking to yourself, Barry, why are you sharing this particular story with us? Well, in the time that I've been talking with various folks in IMYM and sitting in on some of your sessions, it seems that IMYM and many monthly meetings within it are confronted with circumstances that are not completely within your control, requiring choices and changes that ask you to surrender to a future that at this point only God can see. There's a lot of trust and openness in the now and in the days ahead that is needed. I want to share that, in particular, the way in that we as friends have organized ourselves as a largely volunteer body structured in committees that evolved out of an egalitarian theology has worked reasonably well for us for a very long time. It worked particularly well for us through the early and mid-20th century, with the rise of an expanding middle class, increased volunteerism based in expanded leisure, and new technologies like phones, planes, trains, and automobiles. We established new meetings across the continent and new organizations like FGC, FCNL, and AFSC. We have never been a large denomination in compared to others around the world, but the economic and social institutions of that era were favorable to the white middle class that then largely composed liberal Quakers. Over the last 40 years, however, the economic, cultural, and institutional foundations that underpinned modern Quakerism have shifted so much that we can't help but notice that there are fewer friends. Friends have aged, committees are harder to form, and there are fewer children in meetings. How to address these experiences is one of the major conversations that you've been having this week and that you'll be having in the time to come. Over the last 10 years, much like me at Chaco Canyon and again at the hospital in Los Alamos, some of us as Quakers have chosen to double down on doing more of what we have always done. We just need more clerks trainings. We need to help the nominating committee more. There are all sorts of things that I've heard friends say to try and address some of the challenges that we are facing. And in some instances, these things do help and are important. But there are some more fundamental things that we need to look at. Before we go any further, I want to give you a window of you into some of the underlying cultural and economic structures that underpin what I believe are some of our challenges. The presentation and reflections I'll share with you in the next half hour are based in the idea that, unlike me at 29, we need not lose everything to see the truth and embrace change. God had to strip my stubbornness and fear from me to open me. What I'm seeing in these sessions at IMYM is that you are already open to the vine and open to change. I've even seen that many of you are open to the idea that we might change, we might fail, and we will change again. Surrender to God can be painful, and it can also be liberating. My hope is to, in some way, help inform your openness and your discernment. Surrender, after all, is a radical form of listening. It is a path to new life. So, as mentioned earlier, what follows is an abbreviated talk that I gave to FGC's executive committee last year. And I hope that it will help us understand how 100 years of relative stability is giving way to a new and different future to friends, and that requires us to understand the world in which we're operating. So please give me a moment to bring this presentation up on screen. All right. So there's a lot of information here, forgive me, but I want to present you with what I hope is a somewhat holistic view of some of the issues that we're journeying through. Many of these things you all already know. I think perhaps the value here is in seeing some of it knit together. So this is called The Water We Swim In, the economic and social context of this century. So I want to start by simply reaffirming some of the things that I think are really important that Quakers have to offer. I think there are things that are motivating many of you to do the hard work that you're doing in trying to reimagine the yearly meeting and reimagine how you might move forward together as a body. These things are inspired by much of the work of Arthur Larrabee. And I'm not going to go through them all, but I just want to highlight that there are really important, valuable things about our faith tradition. We know this, and I think it's also important to say them out loud. That the affirmation of the full equality of all genders and races, affirmation that there is that of God in everyone, that each person can access something larger than themselves, God, Spirit, Christ, the divine, that all of life is sacred and interconnected, that community enriches and enlarges our experience of God. Revelation is ongoing, and that our experience of Spirit can transform us and transform our behavior, and that the way we live our lives is more important than what we say we believe. It's my experience and belief that these things are incredibly relevant to the time that we live in and are important to the time that we live in, and that it undergirds the important work we're doing trying to reimagine ourselves in terms of how we move in the world as friends, as a spiritual polity. So with all of that said, with the fact that there is so much value here, we know something's going wrong. That's much of what your conversations and discernment have been about. The total number of friends in North America is declining. The pandemic has, for some meetings, not all, but for some, has accelerated attendance losses. At many events, at many different Quaker organizations and yearly meetings, the attendance has been falling. Fewer children at our monthly meetings, harder to bring committees together to form committees. And as one friend put it to me, we have grade. So briefly, one of the things that I want to lift up is just what has characterized the way we have often organized ourselves over this past several decades. So that there's much of the way we structure ourselves and do our business that relies on people who are middle class with disposable income and free time. It relies on people having significant awareness of and experience with Quaker cultural and spiritual practices and history. It often requires friends who can commit to regular meetings, both for program implementation and for the governance of their monthly and yearly meeting. It also asks people to be comfortable with a level of committee work that is sometimes deliberative and centralizing, and sometimes has multiple levels of seasoning and accountability. And given that, at least in the United States and Canada, Quakerism has been a largely white polity, people are often asked to navigate white middle class norms and biases. We've been doing lots of anti-racism work, I think, as a body to try and move beyond that last point. But I think it's also true that something that's been very true and has really influenced how our community has unfolded. So something that I want to underline is that these characteristics do not describe the majority of the general population in this present moment. And I want to talk to you about both the external and internal reasons that this is happening. So one of the pieces, and again, I think these are things that we have all seen, but sometimes it's very helpful to actually see the data to see how it fits together. So over the last several decades, the United States has become a country where if there are couples involved, most of those couples are dual income working couples. With that, we have seen a fall in hours related to volunteerism. So there's much that's good about dual working incomes, and that's important and positive. But it's also true that couples in that situation, especially if they have children or adult family members to care for, they feel very pressed for time. So there's been a significant shift in that way. The next chart over on the right-hand side, I'll just try and abbreviate for you. It's comparing rates of volunteerism from the 70s until about 2015. And to summarize what you're seeing with all these lines is that there's been a significant shift in the amount of volunteer time by age bracket. The amount of volunteer time that was available from, basically 25-year-olds to 54-year-olds has really fallen. And there's a significant higher share of volunteerism that's being done by people who are essentially retired. We have seen that movement within the Religious Society of Friends in our meetings, but it's also been true of the broader society. Some of that has really been driven not only by a change in time availability, but it's also been driven by changes in economics. I think we're all aware that income inequality has increased dramatically over the last several decades. In terms of an egalitarian society that we are, that has really significant impacts for us that aren't always transparent for us to see, but I'll try and help make that more clear as we move on. So the main point I'll make for the graph on the right is that income inequality reached its lowest point. We were the least unequal, if you will, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and it started to climb remarkably going into the 90s and 2000s. Now, this is not happening across the board, and I'll demonstrate this in the next slide. So this is a chart of declining social mobility by generation. What you're going to see is that for those who were born in 1940, the silent generation, and my mom is a part of the silent generation, what's kind of astonishing is if you look at that top line going across, the majority of their generation out-earned their parents. Vast majority. To summarize this chart, what you see is in the subsequent lines, boomers born in 50, boomers born in 60, then you get into the first wave of Gen X and the second wave of Gen X. Each subsequent generation was seeing its economic social mobility fall. By the time you get to Gen X, it's almost a coin toss as to who earned more than their parents and who earned less than their parents. What's not on this particular chart, just because I couldn't find one chart to contain all the generational data, is for millennials and Gen Z, those lines actually get even lower. And so driving volunteerism in many ways, which we're so reliant upon, it's not only time and availability, but you're also seeing a situation where the people who have the time and have the money to participate in various ways are retired. This point on the bottom I'll make. Fortune magazine in its March 2023 edition said, reports that 46% of Gen Z hold 2 jobs. So in an environment where significant numbers of youth are holding multiple jobs, it can't help but, at least at that statistical probability level, impact participation. Of course, individual decisions are individual, but it's important for us to consider overall trends within which we operate. The other piece when we talk about children and participation is simply that the birth rate has changed. There's lots of things that are it's a complex and multifaceted phenomena that this has changed. There's many positives that it's changed. It also is a reflection of many challenges that it's changed. But the reality is that the birth rate has changed significantly. If you look at the start of this chart, in the 1950s and 60s, couples were having at its height 3.7 children per couple, and this has fallen to a fairly consistent rate, being below replacement. Replacement is considered 2.1 children per couple. That's been going on since the late 80s and has fallen more through the period of the pandemic and over the last decade or so. One of the things that I think is important to lift up about that is that when I go back and look at FGC's database, what I see is high attendance for the gathering in terms of children. Numbers of high school students, numbers of kids corresponds almost exactly with those kids coming of age that were born in the 50s, 60s, early 70s. And so a piece of what we're seeing simply is a change in demography, but there's other things at work as well. And one of those things that's at work is characterized here on these next slides. On the left, part of what we have seen is a shift society-wide to less leisure time for teens. They're spending more time on their education. They're spending less time in overall leisure. Also, there's a heightened sense of competition. One of the things that happens in a society that has a lot of income inequality is a heightened sense of competition. That heightened sense of competition has led, at least for families that have aspirations for their children to go to college, has led to many more people applying to a vastly larger number of colleges and admissions rates falling. It's a reflection of that sense of competition, which then feeds the sense that their kids need to be spending more time in various forms of educational activities. Essentially, there's competition. I'll say anecdotally that I can't tell you the number of parents who have talked with me about various Quaker events and said, well, we're choosing between taking them to summer gathering or them being enrolled in a robotics camp, or them being enrolled in X, Y, or Z. So there's this heightened sense of competition comes into play as well. Then there's something layered across the top of all of this that we have all been seeing in the news. We've been experiencing, we've heard discussions about it, but I think it's part of the overall container within all these economic and demographic things are unfolding, which is the appeal of Western religions in itself is fading. So on the left, this is from Pew Research Center. I just want to show you the overall trends that the number of people in the US who are Christian has fallen from 90% to, in 2020, 64%. by 2070, they're not sure, but they're projecting somewhere between 54 and 35%. The numbers, the trend is continuing down. But again, that's the overall. Part of what's really important is to understand what's happening generationally. The chart on the right says more young people are religiously unaffiliated by age. And so when you look at these numbers of people by age, this is from 2016, you can see that generationally, as we go on, higher and higher percentages of youth are unaffiliated to religion. Why is that happening? I mean, you can see 18 to 29-year-olds, 38% are unaffiliated. So the following is just a brief snapshot. It's taken from The Atlantic and a number of other sources, but a huge piece of it is the fading moral authority of churches. Gender discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination, racial discrimination. There's a long list of ways in which youth perceive churches to essentially be failing. Also, there's been an incredible association over the last few decades of politically right-leaning evangelicals being identified with Western religion broadly. And what a number of studies from Pew have demonstrated is that in past generations, what you saw was that adults would leave sometimes those churches and find their way to Unitarians, find their ways to Quakers, find their way to other religions that were perhaps more theologically left-leaning and politically left-leaning. But what's been happening recently is those younger people are just opting out overall because their association of Western religion with the evangelical right is so strong that they're not looking for alternatives. They're just leaving religion. Also, the denial of science and discriminatory doctrines has driven many away from religious participation. And another point that has been lifted up by a number of Quaker youth that I've talked with over time is that changes in modern work hours have also made traditional church going simply more challenging. Many of them are working at times when people meet for worship. So let's move on more deeply to that values gap with youth. So there's an organ, this is on the left is from Pew, and on the right is the State of Religion Young People report that comes from Springtide. Springtide is a Christian research group. So the left is no shock at all. Partisan gap in political values continues to grow. 1994 to 2017. All this is really saying is that partisanship has gotten far deeper. We all know this, but it's interesting to see it represented in numbers and then to see it translate over to what young people are thinking and feeling about people who are religious, older people are religious. So this values gap, what it's basically saying, what these young people were asked in this survey was, what do you care about in terms of these particular values, and what do you think Christians value? And what you see is an enormous gap all the way down. The red is the gap between what they care about and what they think religious folks care about. What probably has already struck a number of you is that a lot of these things are things that Quakers care really deeply about. But the perception of young adults is that people who are religious overall do not care about these things, which is going to take me to the next piece. I'm not going to run us through, it's a lot of dense language, but we are really at a point where when young adults, millennials down, are asked what they need to see from a religious community, what so many of them have said is that they need to see an intergenerational, multiracial community that matches their value system. And what's also true, based on what I was reflecting to you, is there is you could almost call it a bias hurdle that friends have to cross. Let me talk about that a little bit more. So I think it's been very important for many friends for many decades, given the way the theology of many other Christian branches, that we are non-proselytizing. And I think there are many friends that rightly we believe there are many ways to God, to the divine, to spirit. I think it's one of our strengths. Simultaneously, that belief in non-proselytization has gone to the point, I think, for many friends, of not saying anything at all about what we believe to the outside world. I will share with you a particular story just to illustrate the point. I remember I was on a flight several years ago when people would talk more to each other instead of staring at their cell phones. And the woman next to me struck up a conversation with me. And I don't know what prompted it, but she asked me something about religion, and I shared that I was Quaker. She was kind of startled. We talked about it for a while, and at a certain point she said, "So can anyone be Quaker?" And I said, "Well, if you are convinced that that's the right path for you, of course." And she said, "I grew up in Philadelphia. I thought Quakers were a closed society. I didn't know you could become Quaker. I thought you had to be born Quaker." What we have, I think, often relied upon was this idea that people would find their way to us. I think with the data showing more and more is that while people do still walk through our doors, they do still find us. Millions of people read about us online in various ways. It's also true that there's what is the phrase, a confirmation bias that people have, that basically you have to overcome their ideas about who we are, what we are, for people to walk through the door. And part of what I want to talk with you about today, as we think about what is the future of the religious society, friends, both in how we structure ourselves, but also how we interact with the outside world, is that those old ways of being, the idea that our outreach really is our activism, that people will see the good works that we do and they're attracted to that and they'll walk through the door, or they'll independently find us. More and more, that's not happening because it doesn't clear the barrier of the cultural biases against Western religion. Also, I've heard a lot of people talk about, outreach is visibility. There are lots of things that the various friends organizations, including FGC, does that are really valuable in terms of visibility, that you do as IMYM and that your local meetings do. But visibility, which I define in some ways as sharing information about who we are, is important, but it also does not necessarily clear the hurdles that people have in their mind. And an example of that I'll lift up is, I would say, some of the things that have been written in the newcomers areas, the FGC website, are on the order of having been read 100,000 times plus. Some of the Quaker Speak videos have been seen hundreds of thousands of times. It does, in and of itself, on its own, these things do not necessarily translate into people walking over the threshold of a Quaker meeting. And I'll share something from my own life to kind of illustrate the point. I was not, as you heard from the story earlier, I was not raised Quaker. I came to Quakerism as an adult. Part of the way I came to it is that I had a professor who mentioned an interest in Quakerism, and I started reading about it. I read about it for 7 years. I did not cross the threshold of a Quaker meeting until I ran into someone who was volunteering at a theater where I was also volunteering, and they said the words, "That speaks to me." And I had read enough Pendle Hill pamphlets to go, "Oh, are you a friend?" And they said, "Why, yes." And this I always loved this because it kind of reflects that non-proselytizing. They go, "Oh, yes, but why would you ask?" Well, it ends up that they took me to my first Quaker meeting that very Sunday. And they took me because after we talked a little bit more, they said, "Would you like to go with me on Sunday?" And I went, "Sure." it took that invitation for me to stop reading about it and to go. And part of it was that my own biases reflected some of what people are carrying around in the broader society. Everything I've read sounds amazing and fantastic. I am not at all convinced that this is going to be the experience when we walk through the door. So I needed a nudge. I needed an invitation. And so part of what I want to talk with you is about invitation-based outreach. So our message needs to be clear and proactive for people. The very things that I said in the beginning, I think, are things that we need to be saying to the broader world. It's out there. We can access it, but we really need to be saying these things more. I also want to just underscore that I think in many ways, our theology is not the problem. Expectant waiting, our core manner of worship is not the problem. Thousands of people visit Quaker meetings each year. Our issues in terms of number of people in our meetings, I think, are really twofold. One is that we do not engage in invitational outreach. And the second is some of our structures that we have built over a long period of time don't match the times within which we are operating. I talk about that through the lens of what I've been calling the meeting experience. So the meeting experience is not just expectant waiting. It's not the core of worship. It's the total experience of participating in the community. It's the container that frames and strengthens silent worship. It's childcare, it's spiritual formation, it's community building, it's pastoral care at critical life moments and transitions, and it's opportunities for meaning making and participation. When we look at the total Quaker experience, we can begin to deconstruct and reconstruct the Quaker experience for the times that we live in. So the top needs for many spiritual seekers, and this comes out of program work that has been done across a number of yearly meetings, has been done across FGC. Some of it's coming from really important work that Emily Province, an independent minister, Quaker minister, has done, especially around parents and children during COVID. In fact, if you haven't been to her website, look up her website, Emily Province, and some really incredible research there. That's important for our meetings. So in a time-pressed, stressful world, there is a need for consistent pastoral care, especially related to child care and children's programming. Opportunities to build connections during the meeting of worship and at other times of week. And again, that care around major life moments, birth, coming of age, commencement, weddings, aging, memorials. So I just want to lift up some things that have been experimented with by various meetings over the past several years. There's all sorts of things that have been tried. I'm not going to say that there's any universal solution because every meeting is different, every circumstance is different. What I appreciate is that people have been trying various things and having success in trying various things in order to try and create a meeting experience that that works, that gives access to more people to have this powerful experience that we call Quaker. So some of the things that people have done that I want to lift up for you is paid childcare. And a number of meetings have been engaged in that for a number of years now. What I've been hearing is that that's engaged since COVID. Some of what we've been hearing back from parents especially is that parents of small children who do want to come to Quaker meeting, this period of time has been enormously stressful for everybody. It's also been enormously stressful for them. The idea of being the parents who run the program for their kids in the midst of all the stress that has been occurring is an additional challenge. And so some meetings have been turning to having paid childcare and paid children's religious education to try and help with those things. And they've actually been finding that more parents have been sticking when they have made that available. One-person volunteer roles. So often we organize via committee, but there are some things that really one person being charged with something works, if they have the capacity, works fairly well, especially if it rotates. It's a lower burden than committee service. And can allow certain things to happen in a consistent way that people need. Another thing that has occurred, I won't say a great deal, but the experiments are ongoing, has actually been a semi-programmed format for some meetings who have been completely unprogrammed. What this looked like in particular for one meeting where I spent about an hour talking with them about their experience is they said coming out of COVID, when people started coming back, they found community cohesion was really low. And everyone simply going to meeting for worship, sitting down, getting up and going was not deepening the community experience. And so what they decided to institute was they made meeting for worship 90 minutes, but the first 30 minutes was worship sharing with queries before they then settled down into expectant waiting. Um, they said attendance shot up and the community experience improved. And one of the things that that did for them, one of the things they identified, was it gave people an avenue to know and understand each other without having to show up at another time of the week or do community service to get to know people. It was an avenue through which they could access within the existing structure. Again, I'm not saying that there's any one thing that suits all meetings, but I just want to lift up some things that have been tried. Also, there are those who, most meetings have tried or have, say, a Wednesday night and then a first day where people worship. Some meetings have really expanded on this idea of actually having 3, 4, 5 worship times spread out. And what they found, the challenge that they found is that some members of the community never really meet each other because they're coming in at all these different times. But on the other hand, overall attendance has grown because they're meeting people in the times and places where they can actually be there. And they're finding that people who do service work are actually finding their way to meeting based on these different times and formats. So one of the things I just want to lift up in all of this mix is, as the title says, committees are a tool, not the religion. For those of you who have read Ben Pink Dandelion, he talks about the idea that modern Quakerism sometimes can be an orthopraxis, meaning that it's our practices, our structure that holds us together and not our theology so much. And I've actually had friends say to me that, well, I'm worried if we change the structure in the meeting, we'll fall apart because we don't have any common theology that actually binds us together. And, what I want to say to all of you is we actually have, while I know we are informed by a breadth of theology and a breadth of experience, that's one of our strengths. I think that's one of the enormous strengths of Friends, is the way that we are informed by a wide experience of what is the divine. And that even within that wide experience, there are many things that are core to us that I think are deeply and widely shared that hold us together, and that we have the ability to shift our processes and shift our structures, and that we won't fall apart based on that. I think there's room because ultimately what keeps us together is our relationship with spirit, our relationship with one another, and how we ground each other in that and ground in spirit. And so there is room for us to try and be new things. So what I want to leave you with from this piece is just, I think we have an opportunity to reimagine how we co-create the consistent experiences we want without solely using the structures that have worked well for us in the past. And part of what I'm heartened by is that's part of the discussions you all are having right now around IMYM. There's an enormous openness. And I think that openness is part of the key. How IMYM will look in the future, you will decide. And I'm just grateful to see the way that you're trying to approach it. I also just want to say, in order to be faithful, we don't have to have a complete plan that's infallible. Something that I've seen at FGC on a number of occasions is that when difficult things came to the floor, there were those within the body who wanted an incredibly detailed plan of how all this was going to work, that we basically covered every contingency and imagined every pitfall and every success that might unfold from the shift. And of course, part of what occurred when we did try to go there is that then there were those who found issue with many of the details of the plan, and we got stuck. Now, there are many ways in which we've shifted. There are many things we have adopted, but part of what I feel like I've learned over time through my experiences there is that we have to give up part of that sense of control, that we're going to have a plan that's going to anticipate every problem and overcome every obstacle. We can do our best. We can imagine together what's possible. And then I think there's some measure of trust that we need to exercise for each other, that we can change and shift. That after we've made a decision, there is still room for us to adapt to what we experience past those set of decisions, and then we can make more decisions. It's an iterative process. I also want to say something a friend said to me once that really stuck with me is that sometimes we can only see as far as the next good step. We can gather lots and lots of data. We can study things immensely. And there are times in which, my goodness, we just don't know how this is going to work or not work. And rather than trying to imagine how these 10 things are going to work out in the end, we can simply take the next good step and trust that after we've taken that step, we'll be able to then see what the next one might be. Also, I think, the title of this talk is Courage, and I just want to talk a little bit about that. Courage is knowing that we're in uncharted waters. As a religious body, we're in uncharted waters. There's a certain way of doing things that we have done for a very long time. Starting in that period around 1900, rolling into the 1920s and 30s, there are a lot of the structures we use today that were reimagined and reformulated. Rufus Jones did a tremendous amount of work about helping us imagine how we run our institutions and how we run our meetings. We're going to be reimagining for a little while to see what actually speaks to people now and helps them live a deep life walking in community and walking with God. And that courage is simply to acknowledge that we're in this liminal time, and that we can trust Spirit and that we can trust each other to move through this period of time, despite the missteps, because we're going to make missteps. There will be mistakes along the way as we reimagine. And what's also true is some of the things that will work for some meetings won't work as well for others, and it's okay. So I think a piece of this too, in terms of community cohesion as we walk together through this period of time, is that it's been my experience that the community that thrives during times of uncertainty is the one who treats each other with love in both our successes and failures, that says our joys and our tribulations are ours collectively, that encourages us to surrender to Spirit rather than falling back on our individual ego and ideas. And I want to lift this up in some really concrete ways. There have been a couple of times that I have really misstepped at FGC. I think it's inevitable in your work life that there are just days you really didn't get it right. And there have been some times I really didn't. And part of what was a learning lesson for me was to have clerks who said, you actually sat down with me, prayed with me, and they talked about us, and they talked about ours, and they talked about how we're going to change this and correct this and move this. It wasn't mine alone. We moved as a body. And I think that's a particular strength often of friends, and it's something to remind ourselves of as we move through these periods of time, that both the joys and the challenges belong to all of us, and that our commitment in being a body is committing to do as well as we can individually, but also committing to do as well as we can as a body, and being forgiving as these things unfold and we learn. So I just want to say that as you continue to meet this week, and sitting in with you, I'm feeling very confident that you have the openness and the tools to discern together what comes next. I've just heard a number of things that have really buoyed me. And I'm really grateful to have this time with you. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And I now like to spend a few minutes just opening this up. Let's see, I'm just doing a quick time check. I just want to spend a few minutes opening this up to question and answer or observation, if there's anything in particular that's rising for you before we move into a time of worship sharing exercises. And if you want to use the hand function, if you're online, that helps me see folks. And I think your practice has been, if someone has a correct question on the floor, to approach the microphone.
Maya and I are going to help be mic runners.
Good to see you, Andrew.
Hello, Mary McGann from Moab, Utah. I was wondering if there is a possibility of getting the PowerPoint.
Yes. In fact, something that I want to do next week is I'm wanting to put together a resource directory at the end of the slideshow, just so all the source work is transparent. But yes, I can share that soon.
How do we get our email to you? What would be the best process?
Let me put that into chat.
Okay.
I'm sure we could also make it available on the IMYM website.
That would be great. I see online, Kay.
Yes, thank you so much, Barry. I'm doing this by Zoom, and when I first zoomed in on the first day, I felt quite discouraged by how few people were there. And this has been like this amazing, transcendent talk that I feel courage and hope and possibility. And so thank you so, so much. And I'm clerking our meetings. I'm at Mountain View nominating committee, and there are so many things I want to share with my whole committee. so thank you.
Thank you, Kay.
The thing that I've been thinking about for quite a while is that changing of structures, and being able to be courageous enough to do that, to possibly have a half an hour of worship sharing and then an hour of worship. In our meeting, we have a 9 o'clock worship and a 10:45 worship. And the two groups really, some people in those groups don't want to get together into one group, which we would probably have to do if we were going to have 90 minutes of worship. So anyway, I've even mentioned semi-program worship because I've experienced that in other places. So yeah, having the courage to try some of those things is what I need.
Hi, Diane D'Angelo, Mountain View meeting. You mentioned that some meetings are offering times during the week or evenings specifically for service workers. I'm one of those folks that works every weekend. I'm really curious as to how, if you know, those meetings came to offer alternative times. Did they poll people about what would be good alternatives, that kind of thing?
Thank you for lifting that up. Yes, that's exactly what they did. Is, they reached into, my understanding of one particular meeting in particular is that someone who is a service worker who was struggling to make meaningful worship times on a regular basis. Asked the meeting if they could access, use the email system, especially for those who had attended in the past but stopped attending, and reached out to see if additional times made any difference. And they found a couple of times that did. And so, yes, polling can be an effective way within the existing community to find something that works for folks, and then provides the seed for newcomers to possibly find their way in as well.
Okay. Hello, Barry, Ann Beauchamp, and let's see, Quaker House Santa Fe meeting, and also one of your FGC Central Committee representatives for IMYM.
It's good
And
to
I
see
want to
you, Ann.
speak to the experimentation side of FGC, which this year we're having one of our very traditional FGC gatherings in a couple of weeks in Philadelphia, and there's all kinds of excitement and happiness about it, especially on the East Coast, where there hasn't been a in-person gathering for a while. But what we're doing next year, and what Long Range Conference Planning Committee of FGC is working on, is a virtual gathering to take place, I believe, in February. And in the usual slot in the beginning of July is to have an in-person gathering specifically for youth and young adults. And we know it's an experiment, and there are some people who say, what are we doing that for? Well, we're giving it a try. We're trying it out. We're going to see how it works. And hopefully having a virtual gathering will broaden attendance at gathering to more than people that can get there within a day's drive. And it's the kind of excitement and interest that keeps me excited about FGC, and really trying to use the wealth of experience throughout North America that friends share. And by the way, the dinner circle features FGC tonight. So 5:15 our time, we'll be in the Senate room, and I hope Barry can join us by Zoom. But if not, I'll just take it personally. And well, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Barry. I'm John Fretzman from Santa Fe Monthly Meeting. I know there are some Western churches that are growing, perhaps on the Pentecostal side of things, and I'm wondering what we might be able to learn from their experience and their practices.
So, thank you for that question. I think that's an enormously important question, and my answer I have experienced is challenging for some friends, because it's very different from the way we structure ourselves. So some of the church studies that I've been reviewing over the past 2 years, one of the things that seems to be a constant in the research is that yes, there are things about theology that can affect growth. Yes, there are things about technique in terms of outreach and about welcoming and about spiritual formation that all affect growth. But one of the things that seems to run as a thread through it all is the size of the congregation. The studies over and over again have been showing that the larger congregations seem to be growing and the smaller congregations are getting smaller. This is especially pronounced once you cross past about 500 people in a congregation. And it speaks to one of the things that I think is sometimes baffling to people when we look at the overall church landscape, is that overall fewer people are identifying as Christian in the traditional sense. And yet there also seem to be more megachurches. And how do these things go together? And while I'm not advocating in any way for mega churches, what the data seems to show is that as churches get larger, they're often able to provide more consistent pastoral care. And in an environment where lots of people have different challenges in terms of whether it's childcare or dual working household, holding down multiple jobs, working odd hours, any number of things, having the consistent pastoral care in different forms, whether it's for children or young adults or teens, or for those important life transition moments, makes a difference for a lot of people and keeps them in those larger congregations, or draws them even to those larger congregations. So that is that's one piece of the puzzle. I'll share that several friends, when I've reported that, have said to me that one of the hallmarks they think of a Quaker meeting is that Quaker meetings are quite small, and that people know each other very deeply and intimately because of the small setting. And I think there is beauty to that, and there is importance to that. But I'll also share that that very issue I brought up with a group of Mennonites that I was having dinner with one night. They were church planners. And one of them was talking with me about a church they had planted outside of Dallas several years ago. And that church over 5 years had grown from, what was it, 0 to 7,000 congregants in 5 years. And I said, what? How is that even possible? What did you do that made that possible? And the response was, it's all about small groups. And of course, I asked them to elaborate on that. And they said, well, on the one hand, we have the size to provide pastoral care really consistently. And on the other side of the equation, we have tons and tons of small groups. And so there are lots of people who know each other really well and really deeply, even though they're immersed in this larger church structure. And that's why we've grown. And so, yes, I think how we apply that to friends, I think is an open question, but I think there's interesting and important insights and experiences there. I see, Henry, your hand is up.
Yes, and I'm sorry I had trouble getting in, but that's the way it goes sometimes with electronics. Nevertheless, my meeting is experimenting with a midweek worship, in the sense that since the meeting itself does not seem to be able to sustain one, we have thought of doing something on Zoom for the whole yearly meeting, trying to bring everybody into the worship on Wednesday nights, on the first and third Wednesday nights, and leaving room for a little bit of fellowship afterwards. Just visiting.
That's wonderful. And how is it going?
Very slowly, yeah. No, extremely slowly, which is, I think we need to do a better job of how to get the word out.
Well, a wonderful thing is I think you just helped your cause in getting the word out.
Yes. And I think that this has to do with a lot of electronics that are putting pressure on people time-wise, the time available. But I think we need to learn to use the same equipment to strengthen ourselves.
Absolutely. Agreed. Appreciate you sharing.
Yes, I appreciate you too. So that's nice.
Paula, I see your hand up.
Yes. Paula Rhodes, Mountain View Friends Meeting, but I'm also member of UGMA Meeting for Worship, which is unaffiliated. And a PS to Henry's comment. That's why when I want to throw out every electronic gadget in the I deal with in the trash and go back to the dark ages. I persevere because it's the opportunity to connect, not only with people all over your city, your state, but the world. So, and I just wanted to, I raise my hand and thank you for your excellent presentation. Glad we'll have the recording and the PowerPoint, and also looking forward to mostly being online for FGC's gathering.
Oh,
But it's
glad you'll be
excellent
attending.
line up, as well as UGMA's annual gathering, which is in Philadelphia. And also looking forward, I just found out just as this meeting was started that I was approved to be an online person. And the FWCC, this is the Friends World Committee Consultations World Plenary in
Fabulous.
South Africa in August. And I know IMYM is sending representatives, although I couldn't find the names. But I would love to hook up with the actual people going, and also if others might be interested in having some interim conversations leading up to that on the theme. I'd be interested in that. In fact, when I saw the community circles, unfortunately, just a couple of days ago, realized I couldn't put in for one at this session, but I wanted to say that. And also to note in terms of the earlier talking about different patterns of worship, the longest pattern of Quaker service on first days was in 2017, when I was on one of FGC's, Vanessa July's, Quaker delegations to Friends meeting in Ghana, which is unprogrammed, unlike most of the meetings in Africa. And they typically have a whole hour long, roughly, unprogrammed meeting for worship, break for, welcomes and greetings and announcements and what we in Mountain View now call afterthoughts. Take another break and then go to another whole hour at least of worship sharing. So, as of earlier this week, I had an email for those who might be interested in the World Plenary, which used to be every 3 years. Now it's been 9 years, and my understanding it'll be every 8 or 9. They had put out an email saying it was still time to register online. So thank you for being here and for what FGC is doing with the gathering this year, but also for all the other work.
Thank you. Really appreciate it, Paula. And thanks for all you just shared. It's important for people to know all the various things that are happening.
Kirsten Stur from Berlin, Germany. German-Austrian yearly meeting and Berlin monthly meeting. I also want to say thank you. I found it really interesting also from the European and German perspective, because some of the trends are similar, I guess you could say. And I wanted to encourage especially the grayer friends. I mean, I have some gray hair too, it's not, but but I'm on the end of the young friend spectrum kind of, and a young adult friend spectrum, and the European and Middle Eastern young friends. One friend who'd been part of that for a very long time said, well, we kind of reinvent EMF every generation or every 10 years at the very longest. And so I think, and as far as trying out new ideas and courageously reinventing things or whatever, it can probably be inspiring to talk to younger Quakers and younger friends, because they just do that all the time. And yeah.
Thank you for that. Absolutely.
Barry, I'm John Hyde from Pima, Tucson monthly meeting. It's kind of oxymoronic to be having this kind of moment with you. I'm one of the, probably a more Luddite of the IMYM world. And what I witness around me immediately and in the wider circle of our culture is a loss of personalism because of our increasing dependence and even addiction on technology. There certainly have been positives. You did not have to use a lot of fuel to come here today, so the environment smiles. But I feel the experience for me would have been very different if I could actually hug you, if we could be closer. Our meeting is struggling deeply with the issue of hybrid. My question to you, with a little bit, just one little bit more background, is simply to say, I feel our society is becoming increasingly depersonalized, and the technology is feeding that. What is your perspective based on everything you have said today in terms of technology, the video world, and traditional personalism, community? Can we really build authentic, meaningful community electronically? And how does that impact, whatever your belief is, your sense of it is, how does that impact Quakerism today? Will it help us grow? And if it does, will it change us dramatically from our testimonies, or will it be destructive? Thank you.
I'm smiling because I think that's a huge question that a lot of meetings are struggling with, and we're all struggling with in various forms, both in our personal life and corporately as a body. What goes through my mind first is to say that the proliferation of technology, the ability for us to use Zoom and other tools to be in relationship with one another, I think has an enormous amount of positives, and as you're lifting up, it also has many challenges associated with it. I think it's a complexity that we're still trying to untangle. In particular, I view it a little bit through the lens of what's happened in communications overall over the past 20 or 30 years. As someone who's been a nonprofit professional specializing in communications and fundraising for a long time, it has been, my job to use various technologies to communicate with people. And the world in which we're living now is incredibly different from when I started. When I started in those roles at that time, specifically for an art institution, you had the newsletter that you mailed, you had letters that you mailed. That was almost the beginning and the end of it, beyond making the phone calls and then being at events. And then through the internet, communications platforms started proliferating fantastically. And what initially happened is people said things like, it's going to all go electronic. There will be no place for a physical newsletter anymore. In fact, I had a boss who ended our physical newsletter. And instead, what we found, and I think many people have found over time, is the newer technologies didn't replace the older technologies. What happened is that the audience, if you will, fractured. And so there are some people that want to be reached via email, some who want to be reached via text, some who are still wanting to read a physical newsletter, some who are primarily staying engaged through Facebook. The list could go on and on. Of course, that presents challenges for meetings in terms of using communication platforms, because meetings are often quite small, and trying to keep up with the various ways that people are wanting to interact can be challenging. I think in particular, what you've lifted up around hybrid worship and hybrid decision-making is the newest challenge in a sense. And what has struck me over the past few years of the pandemic and post-pandemic is the way that some meetings seem to have done very well with it. Some meetings have been really challenged by it. Some of the challenges have been that some meetings, the technology itself is a challenge to them. For others, it's a challenge around how to create unity in a hybrid environment. different meetings, I think, are coming to different conclusions. And I think it naturally reflects the individuals that are involved and what the preferences are of those individuals. Some meetings have become very convinced that hybrid is both viable and really beneficial, especially in a situation where there's a number of older members who are simply housebound. And so their participation online has been a boon to them personally, and many members of the meeting have found it to be really important and beneficial to have the community together in that way. Some meetings have found decision-making to be somewhat challenging online. I think part of what we're learning, and there's more work for us to do, is how to clerk hybrid environments in a way that it's meaningful and beneficial for the body as a whole, with part of the body online and part in person. I will say, and this is just me personally, not saying that there's a right or a wrong way, but just speaking for me, as someone who has done a fair amount of workshops in terms of spiritual formation, I still find that the spiritual formation work, well, to me, it works really well if it's completely online or it's completely in person. It's a little more challenging in a hybrid environment to have equivalent experiences. That's just me. I think there's more skill for me to gain, and I think there are some people who have learned to navigate that. But I think I've learned that there are some spiritual formation exercises that are really better suited to in person, and there's some things you can do online for spiritual formation that actually are difficult to do in person. So adapting to the format is a piece of this. I don't know where we're going to end out. I think it's too soon to say how it will all unfold. I will say that I think, again, scale seems to make a difference. In terms of the meetings that I've talked to, that hybrid has worked particularly well for them. One of the things, and this is not universally true, but I feel like I've seen it be more true than not, is that the meetings who are a little bit larger have sometimes fared better with hybrid, in part simply because they have the people resources to invest in the hybrid going well. So I hope I know there's no definitive answer there, but I hope it's in some way useful. Anne.
Well, one of the many, many things you've given me to think about today is when you said that there may be a sense among Quakers that since we don't have an organized theology, but we do have a very organized practice, what will we have if we lose our practice? How will that impact us? And I'm thinking of being a Quaker here in the West for 50 or 60 years, and realizing that many times in a meeting, we have people who come from different Quaker meetings where things are done differently, and that each one of us thinks, well, that's the way. And this has often been difficult and divisive. I wonder if we need more outreach to each other in this area. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how to handle that.
For identifying that. You know, I think it is absolutely true. A practice is a great deal. And I can remember being a relatively new Quaker who had started attending in Dallas and then shifting to the Taos worship group. And I was a little bit lost when it came time for business, for meening for worship with attention to business. It was just different. I think one piece of it is simply acknowledging that there are differences across many of our meetings with particular pieces. I think too that there is an opportunity for us to share more in terms of particular practices. And there was a group of friends, and I found this really interesting. They decided, I can't remember who this was. It was a number of years ago. They decided to sit down and compare yearly meeting faith and practice across 4 different yearly meetings. And it was almost kind of they were just interested, and they were identifying some of the things that were very much in common and some of the things that were not. And that in itself was really interesting. I wish they had actually written a report or something about what they had learned and what they had found, because I think it does speak to there's more opportunity for variation without problems than maybe some of us suppose. I think another piece of this, and this is something that I took out of my involvement with Quaker Quest. Quaker Quest, when presentations were done by speakers, they often asked that there be 3 people that do the presentation, and sharing from their experience. And the reason why they did that is that almost invariably the 3 people were sharing different perspectives and different practices on the same issue. And part of what it did for those who were listening to them was to help drive home that very point that there's variation of thought and practice amongst us. And so I found that to be very beneficial within that program, and would love to see that type of format in more places among friends.
Barry, Jamie Newton from Gila Friends Meeting in New Mexico. You've been observing our revealing and thinking about the Way Forward Working Group report. And I think you know something about the circumstances that led the yearly meeting to seek a way forward. I think what we've put out is better described as an approach than a comprehensive plan. It invites friends to serve the yearly meeting in ways that reflect their interests, their skills, their passions, their leadings, and proposes a steering team to take a kind of light and lively monitoring stewardship approach to responding to realities as they are and to the human resources that rise for the yearly meeting. It seemed to me that it resonates with what you were saying about releasing yourself from a need for control and going toward trust and love-based, spirit-led work. I wonder, from what you've experienced with us in the last day or two and the background you were given before, what are your reflections on what lies ahead for us? Do you feel wildly enthusiastic, elated, optimistic, guardedly, cautiously hopeful? What?
Thank you. So on that last piece, you know, what arises for me in terms of what am I feeling? I feel very optimistic. I feel that in part because of what I've seen in the couple of sessions that I've sat in with. But I also feel that in part because for a number of years I was part of this body, and there are a number of you that I know, and I understand the depth of spirit that exists within this community, and that gives me hope. In terms of the details of what's been presented, I also recognize that while I was a part of this body for a number of years, I have also been away from it for a number of years. And so what sits in my heart is that you will be doing the discernment you need around the details that have been lifted and how you wish to embrace them in whole or in part and implement them. I will say that my experience over time is, just to reinforce the point, there is a variety of ways that we can move as a body and for the work to be done, and that on the whole, what has been presented is not outside of what various bodies of Quakers have done in various ways. So I think it is outside what your current practice is, and that there is reason to believe, based on the experience of others, that depending on how you choose to move as a group in a body, that it could be perfectly serviceable for you. But, you know, again, that is for all of you in spirit to see how it unfolds for you. I'll say in particular, there have been meetings that smaller groups helping guide things has been enormously beneficial. And then for some other groups, they have needed some larger bodies for various reasons. Lisa, I see your hand up.
Hi, thank you. I was interested when you were talking about the smaller communities getting smaller and the larger communities getting larger, and that in the larger communities it was drawing and keeping more people because of different things to offer. Because I did experience that with my daughter. Her first 12 years of her life, we both went to Quaker, and she liked the little kid events and the middle school events, and we went on little trips and she loved it. And then when she was 13 and we moved to Denver, there wasn't much for kids her age. There weren't, not really, we couldn't find anything going on. And it just so happened, I was raised Unitarian, but I became Quaker in my 20s. They had a ninth grade Unitarians had a ninth grade trip going to Arizona, and then they had a coming of age group, and then they had a sex education group. So I kind of brought her there because I wanted her to have community, even though I had mixed feelings because I'm Quaker. But now that she's 23 and she comes to visit me from where she lives, she's Unitarian and I'm Quaker because of that transition. And I just didn't know if you had any thoughts on that at all, about that type of, it kind of relates to what you're talking about the larger communities offering more.
Thank you for lifting that up. I think that's a perfect illustration of what happens sometimes. And I'll share that in a meeting I used to belong to on the East Coast, there was a couple that started attending. And what I learned in talking with them is they had been Quakers in their 20s when they got married. Then they had children and they went to the Unitarian Church after they had children, and their children were now grown, and so they came back to Quakers. And so, this ability to provide meaningful experiences, I think for children is a huge piece of the mix. I'll share that, and it's a huge piece of the mix through a number of different layers. I think for Quaker meetings. Some friends talk about it through the lens of, well, gosh, if there are not young people growing up to be Quakers, then we may not have a religious society of friends. I think there's, and I understand the part of the truth that's spoken there. But I want to lift up that when I first became General Secretary, there was something I did when I was visiting meetings, just because I was very curious. I would ask people to hold up their hands who had found their way to Quakers past the age of 20. And as I went from meeting to meeting to meeting, and in fact, I think I did this at Mountain View once when I visited Mountain View probably 12 years ago. What I found in the room is that the vast majority of people raised their hands. They come to Quakers as adults. They had not been raised Quaker. So, in terms of convincement, lots of people come to Friends as adults. But for the spiritual formation of children, the value of being raised Quaker is just enormous. And whether they stay Quaker or not, there is just this huge, I believe, value in that. And I'll share it even to the point of through the lens of many years ago, I was actually in Taos and I'd been invited to dinner to someone I didn't know very well. They were having about 12 or 14 people over, and there was a young man there. He was about 18 or 19 years old. He was visiting. And we talked for about 10 minutes, and I suddenly stopped and I said, "What Friends school did you go to?" And And he goes, how in the world would you know that I went to a friend's school? And I said, I can tell by the way you're interacting with me. And I can often see that too in the way that kids interact with me, where there's a meeting where there's a number of Quaker children. So I think for that, the spiritual formation of children, it's huge to have, whether they choose to be an active part of the polity later or not. The other piece is for the parents. There's an enormous amount of parents that I think really want the opportunity to come to worship and be in worship. And if there's strong children's programming, they have that opportunity to come and to be present for themselves, for their own spiritual needs, in addition to the needs of their children. Some of the ways that addressing this I'm starting to see, or I'll give the example of Cleveland Friends meeting where I attend, which during the pandemic, Cleveland Friends meeting made the decision that they were going to start to pay for childcare and for first day. And they had not done that in the past, is my understanding. And while it's taken a while to get that up and running, it is up and running, and I think it's making a difference. And there are more parents who are starting to stick because they know that reliability is really there. There was another meeting that I talked with once that it was really kind of astonishing to me. I loved the faith with which they stepped out. They said that, we really want to see more children in our meeting. And I said, what steps are you taking? And they said, we decided to build a playground. And I just went, how many kids do you have right now? And they went, none. And I thought, now that is faith. That's amazing. And if I were a prospective parent of that meeting, I mean, the idea that they're committing to building a playground when they had no children just speaks volumes. So I think there's also an opportunity around intent in all of this in terms of how you approach it. I hope that's helpful.
One, just to clarify my question a little bit, like my
Sure,
daughter
sure.
was raised Quaker up till 13 because in the different communities, there was a whole lot that they offered that was really incredible and awesome. And she learned how to sit quietly. She learned a lot. That was amazing. Her first 13, like her formative years. But then after that, when we got here and I couldn't find things to connect her with, and there was all these things over there. I mean, what would have you done in that situation? Or maybe that's not a fair question, but I guess I wouldn't have, as a parent, they offered such amazing things, but I have Quaker values, so I was really torn. But she had her first 13 years being Quaker, but do you understand the dilemma a little bit?
I think I'm hearing you. And, I'll say back to you that I think what I'm hearing you say is that when you find yourself in that situation of the children's programming is not available in the way that you might hope, what are the steps that you might be able to take?
Exactly. And it's more middle high school rather than children, even though they're still children. She was older child, teenager.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah, I think part of it is to bring that piece to the meeting. I think there is a tendency with many Quaker meetings to be more centered on younger children. I'll share that. Let's take Durham, North Carolina meeting as an example in this particular sense. One of the things that they did was they started thinking about children in terms of phases of childhood. And they actually, when they built a new meeting house, they actually built 4 separate rooms for children. And with the idea that at different stages, children needed different things and they needed different fellowship groups. And one of those rooms was dedicated for teens. And they really worked on what the programming was like for teens. They also took the step of hiring somebody to coordinate all of the various programming for children at different ages. And so that's just one piece that pops to mind.
Thank you very much.
And I'm seeing the time. I had originally intended to switch us over to a short worship sharing, but in seeing a number of hands up, I think I'm going to assume that there's continued value in us continuing in this format for a few more minutes. Cheryl.
Thank you, Barry. It's nice to see you again and share some time with you. A couple of things came forward for me. One was that we did have a very nice FGC electronic meeting earlier this year, and that was very helpful. First time I'd ever been to FGC, but it was very rich and meaningful, reaching across even those places. And part of that was that I was with FWCC as well, doing that, reaching across. So thank you that your meeting is even thinking about that. The second thing is, you have said that you've belonged to several different meetings. And one of the things that I know that I have heard from young people is, do I have to leave my meeting, my Intermountain yearly meeting, or my Gila Friends meeting, if I move away and I go to college someplace else? Or can you sort of, you have experience with that, so that maybe you can speak to that.
Yes. So it's interesting you say in that way, because it's part of my current experience. I'm still a member of Arch Street Meeting, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, and I've been sojourning with Cleveland Meeting for the last 4 years. I am getting to the point where I am getting ready to switch that membership, but I haven't quite gotten there yet. I think for young adults especially, this has been a huge question and issue in terms of, well, in some ways, it's the definition of community. You know, what is community and how do you participate in that community? I think in particular, the pandemic and us bringing many meetings into a hybrid format has changed that discussion. And so there are quite a number of people of all ages now who, even though they have moved, they're continuing to worship with their home community. They're just doing it online. I think there's a couple of FGC staffers right now who are in that. They attend their home meeting regularly, even though they live many hours drive away now. So so that online component, I think, shifts the conversation a little bit. But in terms of overall membership, there are those who have been raising ideas around, you know, what could it look like to belong to a larger body than simply my monthly meeting? And if I belong to a larger body, would I then not have to transfer memberships when I move? This has particularly come up from a number of young adults. And some of the response to that has been, you know, New York Yearly Meeting actually now has yearly meeting-wide membership. And there are some young adults who are part of the yearly meeting. That's the primary place where their membership is lodged. Of course, some other young adults have in New York that I've talked to have said, that's fabulous as long as I stay within the region. There's still the question of, when I leave the region, you know, is there something beyond that? It's a question that I don't think we've explored, because traditionally there's been so much emphasis put on the monthly meeting as the container for our spiritual growth and our community. But I think over the coming months and years, that conversation of larger membership will probably continue to grow.
Friends, I'm going to interrupt. I'm looking at the time. I'm aware that parents are very shortly going to have to go pick up their children. I wanted to check and see if Barry had any closing remarks that he wanted to offer. I have a couple of announcements, and I wonder if there might be a way for this conversation to continue beyond this. It would have to be in a different location, but Barry, do you have closing remarks?
Thank you, Andrew. There are a couple of things that I want to share. One is simply that from 3:45 to 5 p.m. I'll be online for a friendly circle, and this is specifically about invitational outreach. So if you have an interest in that, I hope to see you there. I also must admit I need to locate the link for that particular piece, so I hope I can locate that in the next few minutes. In terms of closing remarks, there is just a short little image or story that I would love to leave you with. So there's a children's book called The Little Tree by Lauren Long. My 5-year-old Auden asked me and my wife Beth to read it to him repeatedly last year. In the story, there's a little oak tree that when winter comes, it refuses to shed its leaves. It hangs on to the brown curl leaves through the long winter, and again the next winter, and again the next winter. Other little oaks begin to grow really tall and strong all around it. And then finally, after the urging of some deer and some squirrels, it stops hugging its leaves, lets them fall gently to the ground. And in the springs that follow, it grows tall and starts to bask in the sun. I just want to leave you with that image, because when we think about what matters to our community, when God is leading us, and the many changes that I think are before IMYM and our monthly meetings, all of us as friends, let us not hug and hold on to our old leaves. Let's have the courage to allow new leaves to grow and stretch ourselves out to the sun. I think we have an enormous opportunity together, and I'm really grateful to spend this time with you.
Okay. I'd like to remind you that we have a friendly circle, which for Barry is going to be 7:15, but for us is going to be 5:15. And if it's possible to make sure he can join us, if that'll fit in your schedule, that would be wonderful and a good way to continue that conversation.
In here, next is Carolyn Cuban is leading a dance party. So please come with your favorite songs and dance. In the outdoor space, we are going to meet for kite making, although because it's raining, we might end up moving indoors for that.
I can just, the kite speaks. If it's raining real hard, there's those sort of couches sort of right inside a little ways from the door, that we could make them there today. And if it's raining, we can't fly them today, but we can fly them at this time tomorrow, because tomorrow is supposed to be sunny at this time. But since I told people today would be when, and I've got the kite, this is what they end up looking like after very little effort on your part.
Barry's friendly circle will be in the Florida room, which is downstairs.